All right, everyone. Faz, welcome back to another Ben Faz collab. Today we're talking about triceps. Maybe we can make this a more regular thing. Okay, who knows? We'll see. Last time we had a lot of great responses. And so today we're going to talk all things triceps, triceps training. Can you bias the long head? Oh my God. And just insofar as like a layout for this conversation, this is totally unscripted. We are totally unprepared. However, what I'm going to do first is I'm going to kind of go over the biomechanical stuff for everyone listening and just kind of my 2 cents on what a lot of the claims being made right now suggest in terms of like how you should train, and then my agreements, disagreements, and then Faz is I think going to go over some of the research-based stuff. So we'll try to make this pretty casual, and I'll just jump right into it first. So for those who don't know, which I would be surprised if anyone listening doesn't know that there are 3 heads of the triceps. Interesting fun fact, I believe in some cadaver research, there have been 4 or 5, up to 5 heads of the triceps found. So some people are freaky like that, I guess. And just as a brief introduction, I'm going to start from this perspective, and then I'm going to just isolate my smaller bones here. You have 3 heads, and 2 of them cross the elbow, right? So this is the elbow joint right here for everyone listening. This is where my index finger is. And basically what the triceps do is they attach to this bone right here and they just pull it this way, right? So from the side, what that looks like is you see all these fibers. This blue string comes down to this ulna bone. This is called the olecranon process. And what this triceps does is it pulls upward like this. And what that does is it moves the form like that. Okay, so this is why doing a triceps extension trains the triceps. So 2 of the 3 heads, they only cross this joint right here. The third one also crosses this joint, but it is also attaching to the shoulder up there. Okay, and this is the long head of the triceps. Again, most people listening are probably familiar with this, and that is going to lead us into some different stuff. Okay, so Faz, I've done some preparation here. Okay, I've made my own little tiny little model. Okay, so we can visualize this. Faz, something I'm going to request from you is as I'm going through these motions, I want you to tell me 2 things. Okay. One is if I'm not making any sense, give me a Ben, please stop. Because if it's not going to make sense to you, it's not going to make sense to anyone else, probably. And then 2 is if I get too tangential, as you know that I can tend to, give me a little slap on the head and I will return to baseline here. Okay.
Okay.
So for those of you who have heard about the long head, okay, here's my representation. It's green band. Many of you will have heard that it is a shoulder extensor, which is to say that in addition to doing this, it can also do this. Okay, so those are 2 separate functions that it has. It can do this, and separately, it can do this. That has some validity to it, we'll discuss. Some of you may also have heard that it's a shoulder adductor, meaning that if my arm is over out here, it can pull the arm inward like this. Okay, both of those things are broadly true. But I want to add some nuance to the discussion here because it's going to be relevant, Faz, I think, when we get to the discussion around pressing and those sorts of things. So here's my representation. Okay. Green band. Just for everyone watching, just know that this is wrapped around, not because that's actually how the muscle is, but the muscle just attaches right here to this little process. This process right here is called the infraglenoid tubercle. It's a fancy way to say below this little socket right here. Okay. So this is where it is. Hopefully that's clear enough representation. So when we look at this muscle, the first thing you'll notice is when the arm is kind of at the side, this is like arm at side position. You can imagine this is my right shoulder blade. My arm is just relaxed. You can notice that these fibers are fairly like parallel to this bone, right? And when we're thinking about, okay, how good or bad is a muscle at performing an action? One of the easiest ways to kind of tell how good or bad a muscle is at performing an action is to look at how it relates in terms of its fiber orientation to the bones that it's pulling on. Okay, so a simple way to think about this is the closer to 90 degrees from a bone, in terms of fiber angle, fiber orientation, the better a muscle will be at a particular action. So, for example, if you, Faz, can think of like the teres major, it kind of runs like this, runs from this bone right into here. it runs very horizontal, right? And so this would be like a 90-degree angle of pull where you can imagine an arrow. I'm drawing an arrow from here inward. Because it's pulling 90 degrees from its bone, you can see how clearly it would be very good at moving the bone, boom, right in that direction, right? So on a spectrum of function in terms of how good or how bad the long head is compared to other muscles at moving the shoulder is very bad. Okay. And the reason it's very bad relative to those other muscles is just because of the way that its anatomy organizes it around these bones, right? Because again, just one example, teres major, very, very good at pulling this bone inward. But think about how bad this muscle would be at pulling this bone inward, right? It's pretty much parallel to the bone, and hopefully this demonstration will help. Imagine if this string were pulling at like 100x the strength that it is right now. Is it intuitive to you, Faz, that it would almost like be launching this thing kind of in like an upward sort of direction,
Yeah,
right?
probably not, no.
Yeah. So when we think about like function of this long head, right, as it's moving, as the arm is moving side to side or forward to backward, you can kind of see that it doesn't change very much in terms of its relationship to the joint, right? Whereas a muscle like the teres major, right, again, pulling this way, it could be very, very good at pulling the arm in different positions. But overall, a muscle like the teres major, for that 90-degree reason, is going to be better at moving this bone and as a consequence, this joint. Okay. Am I making sense so far?
Yeah. You did a video on Keenan flaps before, and I guess your point was similar, right? That's a good
Exactly.
position for the terrace, right?
Exactly. Right. And so when we think about a muscle like the lats, right, the lats, obviously, we won't get into this whole discussion, but it will be part of like the triceps extension thing. They have a good role at they have a like a good ability to move this bone, but then they also have a really good ability to move this bone. And a big part of the reason, and when I say this bone, I mean like the collarbone and the shoulder blade and all those things together. The reason they're very good at moving those bones is because they are pulling at that sort of 90-degree thing. If you picture my collarbone is kind of this way and my lats are pulling that way, right? 90 degrees from my collarbone, super, super good, super, super awesome at moving those joints. Okay. So what we've established so far, three heads of the triceps, one of which crosses the shoulder joint. And that whole little ramble just now was basically just a longer way to say the long head can move the shoulder from, let's say, this position inward. And also, if I'm looking at myself from the side, it can move the upper arm from here to this way, but then it has a very, very reduced ability to do those things compared to our other shoulder extensor muscles, namely the teres major, the rear delts, and the lats. Okay. So when we're thinking about understanding the triceps from the perspective of the shoulder, in terms of, okay, what is the difference between the overhead extension and the extension at the side and the extension out this way and a press, right? The conversation around how do we bias different heads of the triceps is mostly then just related to, okay, based on the long head shoulder function, um, how does the given motion relate to the function of the long head? Okay, so let me just be more clear about that. If I am doing some kind of pressing action, okay, the other two heads of the triceps, they are happy campers, right? Because they're just going to straighten the elbow. So regardless of what kind of press I'm going to do, they're always going to be involved, no consideration of the shoulder position. But when we're thinking about how little or how much the long head is involved, we have to consider the fact that the long head can produce force at the shoulder to some degree, which may or may not essentially benefit the motion we're trying to create. So just a very simple example. If I were just picture the most ridiculous thing you can think of, okay? Imagine if I were doing a triceps extension, right? As I was raising my arm up, right? So I'm raising my arm up as I'm doing the triceps extension like that, okay? If I am raising my arm up to the side, right? You can see how pretty clearly that's a direct sort of opposite motion to what this would want to create, right? So if I'm raising up to the side and my long head wants to go like that, right? If my long head contracts, imagine it just contracts absurdly hard for some crazy reason. I put an electrode on there and I just zap the hell out of it. If it were possible, okay, in that theoretical scenario, my long head would basically just be holding my arm here, right? Because the more that I sort of tried to perform the opposite function, the more that this long head would resist. So if we're simultaneously performing an elbow action and a shoulder action that opposes this muscle, it makes sense, at least on an intuitive level, how the long head's recruitment could be decreased if you are performing an opposite action as you were trying to do that triceps thing. Okay. Are you with me?
Sure.
Okay. So now the question becomes, well, how much does this actually matter in practice? How do we see it show up in the context of people who take training seriously, who are training close to failure with relatively standardized technique across the same exercises? Like, is the long head discussion something worth talking about in the context of advanced lifting? Obviously, I think our answer is by implication, yes. I think it's important to discuss these things on like a more nuanced level. But the question is not so much that as something more like, well, what does this mean for practice? Like what does all this anatomy jargon stuff mean when we go into the gym and we're doing a triceps push down or an overhead extension? And so that will kind of lead me into this next little segment here, where I would like to first sort of hand it over to you before I start to talk about some different applications, unless maybe you think it would make more sense for me to just go over some examples of when, in theory, the long head might be more involved versus less involved. Do you think it would be more appropriate for me to do that first?
Yeah, yeah. You're in a good role. You carry on.
Okay.
I'll jump in when I can.
All right. Yeah. Remember you're slapping me.
Right.
Okay.
No, it's
So
all really interesting so far.
okay, good. All right, all right. Hopefully we're making sense.
Mm.
So I'm just going to share this. Faz, let me know if you can see my screen
Yep, got it.
now. So I made this post where basically I was saying, okay, this was a triceps mistake. And what I wanted to highlight was just this idea that in a rope extension, we should be actively trying to extend the arm as we use the triceps. Okay, so I'll play that one more time just so people can see it. So this is what I am calling a mistake. And in the context of this exercise, the reason I'm calling it a mistake is because people are doing it intentionally, right? So what people are saying is, okay, just focus. If the long head can extend the shoulder to some degree, again, very bad at extending the shoulder relative to our other muscles, then doesn't it make sense, Ben, to simultaneously extend the shoulder and the elbow at the same time?
Mm.
And my stance on that is no, it doesn't make sense to intentionally teach someone to do that because you have these other massive muscles that are going to have a really easy time pulling the arm back, right? This is the quintessential old school lat exercise is like the bodybuilders who are just squeezing their arms into their body, even with a straight elbow, they're feeling their lats, they're feeling their armpits, right, where their teres major, they're feeling maybe some of their rear delts, depending on how they're doing it. So my stance on that is no, we do not want to intentionally try to sort of combine these joint actions. And so hopefully that is intuitive to most people. Just that like, okay, doing this is kind of like feels like a lat thing, right? That's what you do to train your lats.
I'll
Yeah.
just interject 1 second. I think that's perfectly valid. I think there's one possible reason why people might say that they want to do that motion just to initiate the tricep push down. And I don't think it's counter to what you're saying, because I think what you're saying is right. I think it's because with some people they value cheating. And so, like for example, with a lat pull down or a row, they value the initiating a movement with a bit of momentum so that they can get the pull moving. And they may feel the same with the tricep push down. And I'll also say anecdotally, for me, I don't do that now, but I have in the past when I've struggled with elbow problems. It tends to take a bit of pressure off the elbow. So I do wonder if the people who are promoting this movement are maybe doing it for other reasons, which they're maybe not even themselves aware of, but that it just either helps the elbow or it just allows them to use a bit more weight or do a bit more reps. That's all I wanted to add, but I don't think that detracts from your point.
That's fantastic reply. Fantastic. The reason I say it's fantastic is for two reasons. One, I think it's nuanced and correct. And two, it will lead me perfectly into this next point. So yes, we totally planned that segue. In
Very organized.
yes, yes. In response to this post that I had, Faz, please let me know if you can see this video
Yep.
of Jeff. Jeff, GVS, as some call him, by the way, was not in fact trashing me, was actually saying that I pulled a reverse Dr. Mike. If anyone doesn't know what that means, just take a second to think about what a reverse Dr. Mike would look like. And anyway, so Jeff, if you're watching this, the first thing I'll say is Jeff and I are in total agreement here. Okay. And Jeff was basically just giving me some pushback here. He's making an appeal to his massive long head, which, by the way, respect, nothing but it. Um, and Jeff was basically saying, Ben, I kind of disagree. And Faz, basically, GVS's rationale was pretty much identical to yours, which is basically like, you know, this is kind of like a way that I've developed doing it that feels really good for me. It feels better on my elbows. And so I'll talk about all the things that you just mentioned in just a second here. But I want to sort of first just give a little breakdown on the way that Jeff is actually doing this and how he and I are in agreement about this application. Okay. So Faz, let me know that's playing now.
Yep.
Okay. So what
We're
you
good.
all go ahead.
Yeah, we're good.
Okay, good. So what you all notice is that if we look at the way that Jeff is doing this, initially, it looks like he is doing the very thing that I just said not to do. Okay. But if we look a little bit closer at the actual technique here, what you will notice is something very different. Okay. And he even kind of was alluding to this in some of his subsequent stories. So I'm going to do some freeze frames here. And Faz, this is where it may get a little bit sticky. So let me know if this is, if you're going to stay with me. So in this top position, I want you all to use this as a reference point. Okay, so I'm going to use this in red color. So you see this little bump here, Faz? It's kind of
Mhm.
like where Jeff's middle trap is ish. So I want you to use that point as a reference, and then I want you to just sort of pay attention to his whole delt as a reference point as well. So notice this top position, and then if I scrub forward just a little bit, do you notice how much now that bump, just to point it out to people, has moved, right? So you see basically
Right.
this is where his middle trap is now. Okay. And so that's good so far, right?
Mm.
Okay. So what does this mean about what joint actions are actually being created? And I want you, I'll just play this now. I want you to sort of focus on that and look at that as he's going through this. Right. So just watch the trap. So you see how everything is kind of tilting forward. It's almost like this forward rotation of his entire shoulder girdle.
Mhm.
Okay. So that's super interesting, right? Because initially, what people might think is, oh, what he's doing is what Ben just said not to do, which is he's doing this in tandem with triceps extending. But that is in fact not what's happening. Why? Again, because what we see is as he's going through the motion, everything in so when I do this, by the way, this is called anterior tipping of the shoulder girdle. And what that basically is it's a sliding of the shoulder blade and the collarbone kind of tipping forward. And as everything is tipping forward like this, do you see how these things are moving as a unit,
Mm.
right? It's not this distinct, what we would call relative motion
Yeah.
where this bone is spinning.
Mm.
It's actually everything is tipping together. Okay, so
Yeah.
this is very interesting, right? Because one of the things that Jeff says is, oh, I don't feel my lats, I don't feel my teres at all. This is kind of like the way I do it, and yet I don't feel those things. Why is that? Well, because the action there that is being created is not actually shoulder extension into elbow extension or even shoulder extension simultaneous. And again, anyone can watch the way that Jeff does these in any other video. It's all the same. Is he does this thing where he kind of forces his shoulders to elevate, and then he kind of uses what you were describing. He uses that initial sort of jerk of the momentum of that anterior tipping action. And then he finishes with like a really strong, strict elbow extension. And he controls it nicely with an elbow extension out of the bottom. And then what he does to raise the weight further is he actually does the reverse of it, which is a posterior tipping thing. Okay. So when he's doing the anterior tipping thing, if we think about, okay, well, what muscles could control that anterior tipping? It's actually muscles like the pec minor, right? That essentially pec minor attaches to this process called the coracoid process, so it can pull the scapula forward. The costal portion, the lower portion of the pecs can perform that action. Eccentrically, different muscles can do that. But the major point is that when you see a technique like that, when you see a technique that like that Jeff is using, The way that he has gotten to that point is through this thing that we kind of broadly describe as like the lifter's intuition, right? It's like this is an experienced as hell lifter who, over a long period of time, has intentionally or not honed in on a specific technique and a specific sort of motor pattern that feels really good for them on a particular exercise. And so what people will do, I think, sort of more beginner and intermediates will do is they will look at a technique like this and they will try to essentially copy the technique without understanding the intricacies of what actually makes it different from other things that look similar. So my problem overall with people saying, "Oh, this is what you should do in a triceps extension," is they're missing all of the potential context that led that advanced lifter to that point to begin with, which, as you already mentioned, could be something like, "Oh, well, in the top position, if the load goes parallel to the forearm, right, you basically are unloading the elbow in a more stretched position. Whereas if I kept my elbow perfectly stripped here and the load was really pulling up vertical, right, this is super heavy. And so that might not feel as good on Jeff's elbows, where basically what he's doing is he's initiating with that sort of forward tipping momentum. So he has less load here in the stretch, probably feels better on the elbow. But because of the fact that he's really going to struggle down to the bottom, he can kind of toss the cable to get it there and then have a really nice eccentric control from there forward. And this is why you see a lot of those advanced type lifters. I'm thinking back, back in the day of like a Ronnie Coleman-esque. I mean, Ronnie takes it to a bit of an extreme. I think that might not be super helpful for people, but like if you actually look at the way that Ronnie rose, 500 pounds, right? It's actually quite like a beautiful thing where it's this like methodical, like, ankle, knee, hip translation into the shoulder motion. And then he kind of catches it with his shoulders on the way down. So it's really cool to kind of see guys work their way intuitively to those points and then to be able to sort of analyze the physics of why maybe they're doing those things to figure out, oh, okay, this is actually really achieving an outcome that this person is exactly looking for. Whereas the person who makes the 10-second TikTok that says, "Oh, I must shoulder extend and then elbow extend
Yeah.
because I saw Chris Bumstead do it." Well, it's like, why did Chris Bumstead start doing it in the first place? And is it actually doing the thing that you think that it was doing? Um,
Yeah. I
so
think it
overall,
might
that's, yeah, go
it
ahead.
might also be some sort of deficit that this advanced lifter has, not Jeffrey, but somebody else has to work around an injury, which are very practical concerns for some of these pro bodybuilders. I think one thing that hasn't been explained that well in the industry as a whole, especially in more evidence-based circles, is the role of how cheating and cheat reps can actually benefit you when you're training. Like I've had comments on some of my videos about the way I do certain things, but I think it's not always obvious to the viewer that when you're using a what would be considered to be an unusual form, or maybe what looks like assistance from other areas, that it can be used to put more stress on the muscle rather than take stress away from the muscle. And I think Jeffrey, to his credit, was probably one of the first people to bring that to the evidence-based community a few years ago when he was speaking about upper back pull downs and rows, this idea of using a bit of momentum to initiate a movement to actually place more stress on the muscle. Now, outwardly, it looks like cheating. And I think the difference between somebody who's not initiated in how to train and actually feel the muscle versus somebody who is a very subtle thing when you're looking at it as a viewer. So the difference between, say, someone who's just starting out in training may well be that they are just concerned with getting the weight from A to B. And I would say a hallmark of an advanced bodybuilder is an ability to have at least some connection of a mind muscle connection, and to have some, at least if not that, at least have some semblance of acknowledging the role of the muscle they're trying to target when they're doing a compound exercise. And I think that's can sometimes be missing from beginners who just want to move things from A to B. And the type of nuances that they may initiate, like for example, if they bring their shoulders forward in a curl, might actually take stress off the bicep rather than something like this, which is placing more stress on the tricep. So it's a very nuanced thing. And I think one of the reasons why, and this is a much larger topic, so one of the reasons why bodybuilding typically isn't communicated very well is because it is so nuanced. Early in the early days of the internet, powerlifting was everything because it's very easy to communicate numbers and percentages. It's not so easy to communicate bodybuilding and especially this type of techniques. We're getting better now because we have YouTube like this and demonstrations like yours, which are really helpful. But certainly in the early days, and certainly in some capacity, it's very difficult to explain the nuances of this type of stuff. You have to really, ultimately, you have to just look at what is the goal. We're trying to place more stress on the muscle rather than take stress away. But that can be a very nebulous concept for somebody who's just starting out and just trying to get the form down. So, and that includes maybe some of these TikTok reel makers as well. So it's a great discussion so far.
Yeah, no, that's really well said. And the one thing that I would also add to that is a lot of times when people are starting out, I actually think it's a really good idea for them to, in their heads, at least try to be pretty strict with form. Like you can't just like jump to a place that requires experience with no experience. You have to, it's kind of like how learning in general works. It's like you create these hard rules for yourself. Okay, force equals mass times acceleration, right? I have that formula, it's memorized, it's in my head, I can refer back to it, right? But like the more you learn about physics and the more you can apply it to exercise, you're not like thinking in these very formulaic, like black and white mathematic ways. You gain some kind of looseness, right? You move away from the stickiness, you move away from the hard rules because the hard rules eventually may actually start to work against you, right? And the pain and injury. Oh, this person taught me to do it really, really strict, but like my elbow doesn't feel good in that really bent position, right? Oh, maybe if I like allow that swing to happen, that feels a little better. I'd say it's like a constant sort of exploration. So I really like what you're pointing to because um, it highlights the importance of not trying to look at experienced lifters through a beginner lens because that's often what happens is guys look at the way these other people train and they automatically assume that there are the rules that apply to me also apply to them. When in reality, it's like people have been the experienced lifters, they basically like, I think, start from these harder rules and eventually just create their own rules, so to speak. Which is, I'm just kind of echoing exactly what you said.
Yeah.
But the takeaway there for me is also just if you're a beginner intermediate, like be strict with the form. Try to. I think it's fine to say, hey, this is the way that I want to do this thing, and this is the way that I think it should be done. And then from there, actually making it your own, not by some sort of like purely mechanical rationale, but by like, hey, how do I actually feel with this thing happening, sort of a thing.
Yeah.
Um, and I think
To
that's exactly what's happening with Jeff here.
yeah, to add in sort of an analogy which people might relate to from sort of more of my world, programming world. I think as a beginner, certain beginners will have a temptation to program absolutely everything. So an exercise for absolutely every muscle group, forearms and absolutely everything. And in a large number of cases, like adductors and stuff, in a large number of cases, that's possibly unnecessary because they're going to get so much growth just from a range of compounds. So, for example, a beginner might not need specific adductor work or for example, seated and standing calf raises. And they may just have enough work with one variation to just go ahead and just perfect that without, because there are other concerns when you're a beginner. There is learning form. And if you're learning form of 20 exercises rather than 10 exercises, that may be more difficult for you. So sometimes to analogize it, what I'm trying to say is the rules that apply to a beginner may not necessarily translate to the advanced lifter because things get more nuanced at that point. And it's similar to what we're saying here with regards to form. Things do change. And also hopefully what the audience is seeing is we're not just saying they change in a very kind of vague, nebulous way. We're actually being quite specific about how it's changing here. And I think that's a great part of the discussion, with which you do really well, by the way, and I like to think I do on my channel, is breaking down some of the vague generalities and not just hand waving and saying, well, it's different because Jeffrey's massive. Actually, it's different because of this reason. And actually, if we break it down with the model and you do the skeleton, you can see it actually makes a lot of sense. And hopefully
Mhm.
people are seeing that.
hmm Yeah, well said. And the last thing I'd say on this sort of Jeff technique, just on a more specific level to clarify if anyone was still confused, basically what I'm saying is that he is not sort of gaining that momentum through the extension function of the long head, which isn't, again, super powerful. It's more like this anterior tipping thing, and he's initiating with a lot of momentum in the same way that people initiate with a lot of pull down, a lot of momentum in a pull down, right? Where they'll see Arnold like sort of barreling into the top and yanking out of the top position, right? Like that's a great way essentially to change the way that the force and the torques essentially impact your body. And in this case, the way in which Jeff is doing it makes it so that from an eccentric stretching perspective, there's essentially less load on his elbow, more load on his shoulder. And from a concentric perspective, he's really magnifying the load initially, and then he's holding the squeeze in the bottom and controlling it up until his elbow becomes fully bent, and then he's allowing that sort of posterior tipping to occur. So he's using this tipping mechanism thing, but I would never initially be like, hey, beginner, we're gonna anteriorly tip our shoulder. It's just like, let's learn to elbow extend. Let's make it super clear and simple. Let's define some kind of boundary on the technique. And then, hey, you make it yours over the longer run as you do this with more load and more experience and you gain size and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that's big picture thing with the Jeff example. I felt like I had one other thing to say, not just about Jeff, but also about the triceps thing in general, which is ultimately when we're looking at like, and you'll dive into this more with the research stuff. When we're looking at like, hey, how do we bias the long head of the triceps? If that were a clear and an obvious thing that we could do, which is not like super certain by any stretch. It's like, hey, there are, as you've pointed out, many people who have like grown meaty triceps without being overly specific about the position and stuff. My stance on this from like a biomechanics lens would simply just be, okay, given that the long head has a roll at the shoulder, we don't want to be creating a ton of shoulder motion. So if there were a way to bias the long head, it would be just a normal freaking tricep extension where you're keeping your arms relatively still, or a normal freaking tricep extension where you're keeping your arms overly still, right? The long head can be stretched more here and stretched less here. But another thing for people to know is that the long head does not require a lot of shoulder motion to stretch. So we know that this thing is fully stretched when basically if you look at this string, like when it gets as close as possible to this bone, right? So we don't need to go through this and then all this upward rotation overhead. We can actually just raise the arm here, right? Because basically at a certain point of shoulder motion upward toward the ceiling, a lot of it is going to come from this scapula just rotating upward. So Faz, you kind of see how if I raise my arm up to here, like this is like the same length of the long head as if I just rotated everything upward this way, right?
Yeah.
So I could do it up here, and this is tends to be a more stable, reliable position to just shove yourself into, which is I think why it ends up being more feeling better for people. But if you can't comfortably do this, like just start at a level maybe just away from you, or maybe, do it like at this level, like whatever. Just again, the no hard rules thing applies at a certain point. It's like pick a position, see how it feels. This will be a less stretched position. This will be a more stretched position. And just doing some kind of extension here, some kind of extension here, and then some kind of press. I think it's like all you really need for triceps, and many people probably don't even need that if they're being consistent about progressive
But I
overload.
can just sort of press you for a bit more information there. So is your stance that with just a regular push down, you can train the long head just fine? Because I think a lot of people would disagree with that.
Yes, absolutely. I think it's crazy that people don't. I think it's totally crazy that people don't think that. Like, there's no even if I'm trying to think of like, okay, what is the most charitable possible counter argument? It would be that this is in a shorter muscle length, right? As compared to something over here. But if we talk about like muscles this way, like all of a sudden, this muscle is just going to shut off when I'm in this position, right? How many people do you think uphold that standard on a leg extension, right? Your rectus femoris is in a shortened position on a leg extension, and yet everyone and their mom is saying you must do leg extensions for the rectus femoris, right?
Yeah.
So there is a sort of unknown double standard happening there where people are saying that with one muscle. And then the second that you bring it up another circumstance in which that exact same principle is applied, they're like, oh no, it's the different fiber types. And no. Okay, so that's my stance. Solidified
Yeah.
for you.
I,
Uh,
I, I thought so. I mean, just for the audience, I do agree with Ben. That was kind of my attempt at segueing into this other discussion because my stance, well, let me just start the discussion with when this all kind of came out, I think it was 2022, about how we must have the arm overhead to train the long head. My stance at the time was that I'm sure it works, but I think it's very much overrated. And I think there are other positions where you can train the long head just fine. And we went through, because the industry is the industry, we went through a period of time where of extremes. We take an idea which is reasonably sensible, and that is, if you want to train the long head, maybe that's a good position, like you just said. But we then take it to the extreme and say we had people saying that's the only position. So you hear things on Reddit or whatever saying, I'm going to add in an overhead extension for the long head, as if to imply that if you didn't do that, then you just wouldn't be able to train the long head at all. And what Ben and what I'm saying is like that's not the complete picture. I think you can also train the tricep long head with in other positions just fine, and it's going to contribute just fine. I think you just need, just as we always do, have high forces, high tension, and take it close to failure, and you'll be okay. So that's always been my stance, and I made a video about this many years ago, saying that I was very skeptical of this overhead research. So if we do want to segue onto the research side of things now, um, the problem with the research, from what I can tell, is it's very split. And this is probably the reason that we're in this mess, I think, is probably more an indication of the industry and its ability to just completely um, appeal to the extremes, which is not good. So when Ben and I start talking about moderation, then it's not as glamorous and not as sexy. But from what I can tell, the research is very split. There are some studies, yes, which point to the potential need for the arm to be overhead to cause more biased long head growth. But equally speaking, there are also other studies which point to the opposite, and that is when the arm is overhead, it's actually less active. Um, that was, I think there was a study, I think the famous one that everyone quotes for, in that area is choline in 2018, I think. But there are also studies such as Davidson and Alves, which says there's no difference, and it's essentially mimics what Ben and I are saying, which is that it makes no difference. Just train the tricep hard, push downs are great if you want to do those, and there are a range of different exercises for the triceps which are going to recruit all heads of the triceps, assuming you're just pushing hard. So the research is very much split, and I think what we're seeing is hopefully a return back to the middle and a look at the broad range of the research and not just on the ones which are saying this one particular thing. So that's kind of my stance. Just to clarify for everyone, I'm not saying that if you have your arm overhead, you're not going to train the long head. I think that works just fine. However, I also think you can train the long head just fine with other more traditional tricep exercises, which we all did to get big triceps before 2022. I remember being on YouTube very early on and being told that I must have done specific long head work in my career. So it's just absolute madness. So, but yeah, that's my stance, and we can dig more into it if you want to.
Yeah, so can you just expand a little bit on that last part of it and just tell the viewers about like your own experience powerlifting and how that relates to this whole conversation?
Yeah, so my powerlifting career, especially probably the last 7 or 8 years, was very much high frequent and very specific powerlifting movements multiple times a week, where there wasn't really a great deal of room for anything else. So multiple times a week, and my audience will know this, multiple times a week, I was doing bench press variations, including the close grip, feet up bench press, speed bench press, as well as mostly high bar squats and a lot of stiff leg deadlifts, along with conventional deadlifts for speed. So there wasn't a lot of room for additional work. There was some compound additional work done, such as chin ups and rows. There wasn't a great deal of direct arm work done because back then my elbows were in bits, just keeping up with all the benching work. So there was no overhead tricep work done. And at my peak, I was able to bench 400 pounds, and my arms were a large part of that. I was more of a tucked bencher when I did bench. My main assistance was a close grip bench press, and my long head was a large part of my arm. So when I hear that you have to have the arm overhead to train the long head, it just simply doesn't match my experience. And I realize sometimes anecdote and experience doesn't count for a lot, but looking back over my powerlifting career, having had that experience and having predominantly trained in that manner, benching multiple times a week and doing very little else for those pressing muscles, to be told that you have to have your arms overhead to train the long head just doesn't match with my experience. And that has to, I think that has to count for something because I'm looking at this on the other side, looking back, thinking, right, that's what I did. That was the result. And it doesn't match with what people are now saying you have to do to grow that muscle. So at that point, we have to start questioning what people are saying now rather than saying, well, Faz, you're somehow wrong or you know. So that's kind of like where my head's at with all this. I think if you place the tricep under enough tension via exercises like for me, it was predominantly the close grip bench and the regular bench. If you place the tricep under enough stress, I think the long head's going to respond. I mean, just to put it bluntly, I just don't think that when I was locking out 400 pounds, that my itty bitty sort of medial lateral heads were doing the lion's share of the work, and my long head was just chilling out, going, right, you guys take over, especially when I'm a tricep dominant lifter. So that's my stance on that. Yeah.
So just I want to make a commentary on the biomechanics stuff related to that to sort of draw some questioning into the general narrative, because that's one thing I didn't cover before. But a follow-up for you there would be for the viewers, I would like you to clarify the difference between what you just said and what your recommendation for triceps training would be, right? Because there's an obvious distinction between, which I maybe not an obvious distinction actually, which is why I'm drawing attention to it. But if someone comes to you and says, Faz, I want to grow my triceps, are you going to say, oh, train like a power lifter?
No. Yeah, so no, it's a good question. My experience is just simply what I did and what I was interested in for about 15 years of my life, and the resulting physique which came from that. But my recommendations as a coach would be to have a nice balanced routine where you would have a range of compound presses, but also some push down work, some overhead cable work as well, or some dumbbells and barbells. So I generally promote a much more balanced approach, which is fully supported by the research, because again, the research is so split. I think for somebody just looking to grow the triceps and all the heads, I think a combination of arms in different positions generally works well. So by the side, potentially also about here, and then also more overhead. So maybe a push down, something overhead, like a cable overhead extension, and then maybe something more like a dumbbell skull crusher or skull over. Like those are great options, as well as potentially some close grip benches if there is room in the program. Even things like weighted dips, cross cable extensions. These are all things that I utilize. And it really lends itself into a larger discussion about body types and programming. Just to quickly segue into that for people if they're interested, if somebody is a very tricep dominant bench presser, then I may not necessarily have quite as much of that type of isolation work in their routine. I may back off on that. So the level, the variety, and the quantity of the tricep work that I would recommend to a client very much depends on their form, their build, where they bias, their goals, their experience, how much time they have. But essentially, I think the overall answer that I can give is it would be a much more balanced approach than I did when I was a powerlifter, which was very hyper specific towards that. It would resemble how I lift now, and I have lifted for the past 8 years or so, which is in a very balanced way with all types of extensions, be they overhead or by my side.
Yeah, that's great. And what I'm hearing from you is that it depends. Oh my God, who would have thought that something depends on other things? Okay, no, but in all seriousness, I don't know why this blurring thing keeps happening, but we'll just keep talking until it figures it. There we
There it
go.
is.
Um, the one th so I was thinking about this yesterday because I get a lot of questions about, should I do XYZ exercise for X? And my first question is always, what exercises are you currently doing? Because I think people tend to view exercise selection as exercises in a vacuum. And for me, it's always what surrounds your question. So much to your point just now, an example could be, well, are you doing like a lot of like fixed bar pressing? If you're doing a lot of fixed bar pressing, it might make sense to do a triceps extension where your arm is fixed rather than more pressing stuff you're already doing, right? You're beating the same part of your palm with a hammer that you've been beating for 4 sets just prior. Let's just like, we're still going to beat the shit out of your hand, but like, let's just beat your fingertips now. Let's just not, continue to hammer the same exact place. And so this concept of like variability is huge. And we can look at variability through multiple lenses. We could look at it through just the most broad lens of like I'm doing a pressy thing and I'm doing an extendy thing. But we could also look at it through the lens of, what muscle length are we training? What heads potentially are we more biasing? How are the shoulder forces different? And all those sorts of things. So that might be a good segue now into the one other thing I wanted to say about like triceps press related things. And don't let me forget about the bench press lockout if I don't talk about that because that I'm giving you that responsibility fast.
Okay.
So for people who feel good about the thing that we just talked about earlier, where it's like, okay, the long head has a very little role here, it has a very little role here, but hey, it can actually do those things. How does that relate to the context and the force of a bench press? So for people who don't first realize this, the reason your triceps can contribute to a bench press at all is because there's friction on the bar, right? A way I like to communicate this to my students is basically like imagine that the barbell was made of ice. Like what would happen as you were pressing, right? Your hands would just slide way out, right? So your triceps are always extending like this outward. That's all they can do is straighten the elbow. But that outward motion gets translated into upward acceleration into the bar because your hand can't move, right? So that's how that kind of actually happens. I think that might be counterintuitive to some people. Um, and that's also, by the way, like if you compare, say, a barbell press to a dumbbell press, think about just the inherent differences between those two. If my hand isn't fixed and I'm holding a dumbbell, what happens if my triceps contract too hard, right? The dumbbell just goes that way, right? So automatically, if you're thinking about this from a programming perspective, and you're thinking that presses are one thing, then you're going to totally miss out on the fact that if you're only doing dumbbell presses, well, now there's going to be a lot less triceps involvement compared to if you're only doing fixed bar presses. So that's kind of a more nuanced programming consideration, but just I thought that I would mention that. So, okay, so let's imagine the average like bench press position might be like something like here, right? So like I am getting my hand under the bar. It's not super narrow. It's not all the way out here. It's kind of like somewhere sort of in the middle, right? That's kind of the position that I'm trying to mimic here. So if we look at, okay, what would the long head do to the shoulder in this position? It would have a moment, which is to say it would be able to create rotation of the upper arm this way, right? So if I could just magically summon my triceps to contract at 500% capacity, instead of just purely straightening the elbow, it would yank the arm inward, right? So already just from that broad perspective, we have a little bit of inefficiency. And I put that in strong quotations for a reason, which is to say it might not actually matter, right? Because to remember that thing earlier where I was saying, okay, we could raise the arm out and then extend. That's like the most extreme, silly example. This is like a diet version of that, where, okay, I'm trying to press my arm forward, but my long head also, quote unquote, wants to pull my arm downward. Well, there's a little bit of a competing action there because I'm trying to press, but there's also this subtle thing that it's trying to do. So if there's any validity to that claim, it's that if my long head contributes, again, in this theoretical 500%, it could pull the arm inward. Now, the problem with that is that it doesn't account for things like, okay, well, how much is it really pulling in that direction relative to someone's anatomy, right? Because imagine someone preferred the super wide grip press, and now all of a sudden the long head basically is just flush to the bone. Well, it pretty much has like almost as close to zero ability to pull the arm downward as possible. It's basically just seeding the bone into the joint, right? So if you're, say, a wide grip triceps dominant bench presser and you put your arm out in this position, how concerned are we really with the triceps ability to do that? We're not concerned with the triceps ability to do that, say, in the context of a Keenan flap, right? No one is like screaming about their triceps in a Keenan flap, right? For that reason, I think. So this stuff is very, very gray and very, very dependent on how do you do the motion? How much of it do you do? How close to failure? All that stuff. But then also like the positions that you choose in your individual anatomy. Let's just say in a theoretical example that imagine you had like a sort of structural abnormality relative to normal, not to say it's a problem, but just abnormal. Imagine if instead of the long head attaching here, for whatever reason, it attached down here, right? Well, now all of a sudden it would have a better ability to do that, right? As compared to normal people who have it all the way up here. Okay. So just imagine that your long head just became more like a teres major, right? So now all of a sudden, someone might feel no long head at all and experience very little hypertrophy in their long head as a consequence of that press, just because of that structural difference and how that then sort of creates a different torque producing capability of that muscle. So that's that. The final thing I wanted to say on that is that we often look at these things much like in the triceps extension arm swinging example, as if the only influence here could be this relationship that I'm just describing. But we also have this thing that is constantly moving, right? So imagine now this is the bottom of a bench press. What happens when you start to press your arm forward, right? And for viewers, a key point to watch here would be just watch like my shirt, okay? As I move my arm forward, do you see how there's a natural shifting of my shirt, right? That motion is called protraction. And so when the protraction occurs, what that essentially is, I'll do it with just the scapula first. It's basically the scapula kind of sneaking around and forward. And the reason it needs to sneak around and forward is because it's supporting this joint. Because if it didn't sneak around and forward, imagine if it's stuck here. You see how there's nothing to support the back of this? So this by definition has to sneak around. And what is happening, Faz, when this guy is sneaking around? Well, it's moving with the bone,
Mm.
right? So when these two things are moving, much like we discussed when there was this anterior tipping thing happening, right? When these two things are moving together, there's not an influence of this guy really impacting this rotation, right? So there's this rotation and then there's this stuff happening.
Mm.
Okay. So when you get to say a lockout position, where there's a lot of more of that protraction happening, there's not a whole lot of rotation that is occurring just as a consequence of this joint. Both of these things are shifting together. And so what that might mean specifically in your case, Faz, you say your triceps dominant pressor, your lockouts, it's like this is something you basically swear by. Well, it's like if this attachment is anchored, basically anchored into one spot, and this attachment over here is moving a ton, we have very little motion at this joint and a lot of motion at this joint. That seems
Ah,
totally plausible to me that the long head not only can contribute, but may even be able to contribute more because it's playing this really strong role of holding the shoulder together in that position. So it's very interesting how these things can come together and be so different, not only across people, but across different positions in the same person throughout an exercise, right? So you ask any experienced powerlifter, hey, when do you feel your triceps in a press?
workout.
Right? It's just this lockout. This is a lockout muscle, right? So if your shoulder is barely move, if it's basically just like an elbow cranking exercise, well, is it different from holding your arm here and doing a triceps extension? Obviously, right? But it is much closer to a triceps extension than people probably think, just based on the superficial representation of, hey, how much is my shoulder moving? Because much like we discussed with all these other examples, people will now say, if your shoulder is moving, therefore no long head, right? And my argument is, well, there's this whole gradient of experience that people have and people experience different outcomes as a consequence of this gradient and where they fall along that sort of timeline. So,
That's
um,
interesting. So is what you're saying then if somebody's benching and they're keeping their shoulders sort of pinned back, then there's potentially more of a potential for the tricep to have a stronger involvement in the lockout. Is that kind of what we're saying? If the scapula is drawing around.
so I would say that there's a difference between like because this is where the conversation can kind of bridge into the subjective realm of like what actually happens when people follow cues, right?
Mm.
Because even powerlifters who say, "Oh, I keep my shoulders back the whole time," you actually watch them press, you will always see the protraction. Like any strong bencher, you have to kind of by definition see the protraction. If in a theoretical world, though, this were capable of staying still, which again, it's not, we would see more rotation of this joint and then potentially less involvement or of the long head because more of the motion would be occurring through this joint. But because these things are always moving in concert together, I think that's a potential reason that, again, this is like orientation motion kind of, and this would just be like relative motion of the shoulder joints itself. So when these things are, you know, a nice, happy-go-lucky couple who are like spinning around together, that's when we would see, I think, more long head contribution, and we would potentially see less if this thing were capable of being completely fixed.
I mean
Um,
that does make sense. When I was a heavy bencher, I was much more dynamic. So there would be a bit more sort of dip into the chest and draw out. I wasn't a completely solid, still firm bencher with very minimal movement in the upper body. So it's definitely quite possible that there was some protraction and whatnot of the scapula. So I mean,
mhm.
it's helping me to understand a lot of that kind of stuff. So it's very interesting.
Yeah, and speaking of and you can sort of grade this concept of gradations too. People will have different amounts of protraction. A lot of times, people, when they think of protraction, they think of like this, right? But protraction is this is protraction too,
Yeah.
right? So any subtle amount of that motion is still protraction. It's like when people think protraction, they think of like this shitty, like I'm gonna spine flex and overreach and all those things. But yeah, just to know that it's occurring, I think at all is important for the reasons discussed in terms of like the joint integrity. The one other thing that I wanted to say in relation to this triceps pressing conversation is, have you seen, Faz, this exercise where you can picture like cables going behind and like two cables this way and kind of a shove like this, right? Um, to reference Jeff, Jeff does this variation of a triceps extension where he kind of like hunkers over this V bar. It's really like fucking gorilla looking exercise where he's like hunkered over this way and he's kind of doing this pressing type thing. Okay. If you think about, okay, what are the forces of this exercise? If someone has their hands here, the force direction of this is basically straight, so you can imagine it's straight up from the hands, right? And so if you imagine the force, people just listening, you can picture like two cables going behind someone like this. If the cable is inside the shoulder, right? How much force is there trying to push the shoulder backward? It's like very, very little, right? Because if the cable, especially think of it this way, if it's right over the shoulder, right, it's not pushing the shoulder back at all. Because the thing that would push the shoulder back a lot is if you had a force over here, i.e., if you had a dumbbell and it was applying a force from this angle, pushing the shoulder back. So if you do this like very hunkered over gorilla extension, the force is basically essentially inside of your shoulder or at least close to inside of your shoulder. And so there's very little shoulder stuff going on there. So the question to me is not just is the shoulder moving, but how much torque is actually being applied to that joint because that's what's going to either scale up or scale down the relative sort of involvement of the long
Yeah.
head.
If people try that exercise in practice, they'll realize it's quite a stable movement. You don't get a lot pushing your shoulder back. It's actually quite a classic bodybuilding exercise, which has fallen out of favor. You see Jay Cutler do it and a bunch of others, they really lean over. But I've done it before. I practiced that movement a few years back, and it feels great because it is so stable. There's a lot less forces on the shoulder. You lean over and you get a much better sort of feeling and a stable base to press from. So, yeah, good, interesting.
Yeah, so yeah, I was just picturing in my head like a video of Jay doing that. I mean, it's amazing that given his size, he was even able to like get over there. But yeah, people will see that and they will see the upper arm moving, and then they say, "Oh no, long head." And I realized this. I started to rethink all these concepts for the first time when I was training with my buddy, who I think I mentioned to you last time, who's a pro bodybuilder, and we were doing that cable triceps press. And in my head, I was like, okay, this won't be very much of a sort of long head situation. And I said, okay, Ethan is his name. Ethan, what do you feel? He's like, dude, it's like only long head.
Yeah.
And I'm not inclined in that example, especially to doubt that feedback. So that was like, and this was a few years ago, that was the impetus for me to be like, huh, like there's something different going on here. And so I've tried to be much more careful about how I communicate that um, sort of information moving forward. So the one thing that I wanted to now just sort of shove back to you about this whole conversation was in your message to me, you mentioned this concept of basically where there was that one study that was trained, they trained a bench press and GOLAS 2017 at 95% of 1 RM. Can you just talk a little bit about how like magnitude of load and effort in your view changes these things, even if we do see loss of shoulder motion?
Yeah, so this is a kind of another area which might be relevant to both the studies that are being looked at, but also people's training. So not just the testing in the studies of participants, but also just general people's training and people's life experience. So it does appear that the loading will affect which muscles are predominantly used. And the thing is, though, that we see a wide variety of different results with that also, which is one of the frustrating things about the research in this area. We see things go one way, things go another way. So Golas, I think it was, he said that it was like the at 95%, or was it 95 or 90% of a one rep max? Um,
On a
losing me
on a bench press, right?
on a bench press, yeah. Did that increase the role of the tricep?
Yeah.
Yeah, increase the role of the tricep. So we're starting to see that potentially the loading can affect the tricep. We also had another study from, I think it was Hussein in 2020, which looked at just the regular tricep pushdown, but looked at different intensities. I think it was something like 60, 70, and 80%, and the different involvement of the different heads of the tricep based on how heavy the weight was. So there does seem to be an additional X factor there, which is the weight that's used relative to your one rep max and its effect on either which muscle is predominantly used in the chain, but also which head of the tricep is predominantly used. So I think this is why it's such a tricky area. The research is very split. I think more needs to be done. And if anything, it does point to your point, which you were saying about the inter-individuality of this area, probably because it is quite a complicated chain. There's a lot going on, different proportions, people are built differently. Even the slightest change of elbow angle from sort of here to here may well affect things, just the way people protract versus retract. So I think if I was to hopefully we'll end with some sort of practical advice for people. But I think if I was to give people some like, practical advice on understanding the theory, I would say just be open to the fact that there probably isn't a hard stance on this yet. And if somebody is making a strong, bold claim, like you have to have your arms overhead to activate the long head, I think they're being probably a little bit limiting and in their interpretation of the research because I just don't think it's there yet. And there are some great pieces of research out there for hypertrophy. But I think in this area in particular, it's probably a little bit mixed, which also would explain why you have so many intelligent people on both sides of the argument. I think it's a very mixed area. But ultimately, it probably does help to look at, to a certain extent, look at anecdote. I mean, anecdote is a tricky area. I think I'm not one to lean on anecdote, but I think effective exercises and what we consider to be good tricep builders, particularly ones that build the large bulk of the tricep, they tend to get filtered out over the years. So, experience does provide a filter. It's a tricky one because whenever you say anecdote in evidence-based circles, people just sort of recoil. But while I'm not suggesting we look at anecdote, what I am suggesting is we have the experience of decades of practical work by people in the gym, and generally speaking ineffective practices do tend to get filtered out. And this was one of my points with the seated calf raise video recently that I made. And while the research might be split on that, what is clear is that ineffective exercises do tend to get filtered out. So yeah, I think in this area it's more of a wait and see for further research, but until then we can potentially provide some practical recommendations for people in terms of maybe volume, intensity, things like that. Where would you start with that?
Yeah, so in terms of well, just one other thing that I want to
Mm.
just so I definitely think let's end with the practical stuff. I did want to say one other thing that because I forgot to mention it earlier, um, is when you see, I'll just refer back to the Jeff technique. A lot of
Yeah.
times when you see those types of like motions occurring, all the stuff we said earlier is true, the intuition, the building of or the changing of technique with the building of experience. Um, a lot of times you see those technique changes too throughout the course of a set magnify as well. And a lot of times at least I know in Jeff's case, that's intentional, where he'll progressively sort of become a little bit less strict. And the way that I would think about that principally is just that basically what is being done is the set is just being extended more than
Mm.
it would be otherwise. So it's kind of like just a way to, there's no such thing as going beyond failure. I don't know. I don't really love when people say, I get what they mean, but it's like the muscle
Yes.
fails or it doesn't,
Yeah.
so we can't go beyond failure because by definition the set ends.
Mm.
But in that sort of beyond failure, quote unquote, way, a lot of times when people shift their technique, what they're doing is they're essentially distributing the torque through other things so that other things can assist the primary driver. So in that shoulder extension thing, or that really anterior tipping thing in this case, that will become more and more extreme as the triceps fatigue. And that is something that can then continue to help the triceps do more and more and more work. And so that's something that even in my own training, I specifically with triceps will do is I actually become looser with form as the set goes on. But that's not something that I would be like, hey, beginner, intermediate, go, intentionally do that, right? So that's the one thing I wanted to say. Now, in terms
Well,
of go ahead.
I was going to say I'd add one more thing. With regards to training styles, I think the just from the kind of the British angle of potentially lower volume routines, I think when you get to working with lower volumes and higher percentage of your one rep max, generally speaking, you're probably going to see less of that. Like if you look at the prototypical heavy duty trainers like Dorian, Mensa, and some of my training as well, especially recently over the last 5 years, because the weights you're using are slow closely resembling your 5 to 8 rep max, total 8 rep max, you're probably using quite high percentages. So your willingness to cheat just isn't there. Whereas if you look at a more traditional bodybuilding style, such as what Jeffrey does and what you might see in the bodybuilders of the 90s, you generally see that more kind of flowing form where they are willing to just, like you say, extend the set or at least initiate the set with a bit more momentum so that they can get those extra reps out because you can do a lot more of that. You can be a lot more fluid with your form when you're working with lighter weights essentially. So, and I think Jeffrey's while he is getting a lot stronger now, he's kind of known for not being as strong as his size. That's kind of the joke with him. And I know he knows that he also jokes about it. So I think with him, it's the style that he employs it supports what his overall workout structure and the type of weights that he likes to use. It all fits together really nicely, and it's a great example in practice of what we might consider to be traditional bodybuilding. Whereas, like my style, Dorian style, you're going to be a lot more locked in with form. You're going to see a lot less of these form nuances, and it might outwardly look more strict, but ultimately we're probably accomplishing very much of the same thing, just with the different forces and intensities.
Yeah, that's a really great addition. And it's another way also to say, hey, both of these things can work,
Yeah, yeah.
Who would
Mhm.
have thunk? Okay. So in terms of practice, I'll just very quickly lay out like what I'm currently doing for triceps, and then maybe you can do the same, and then we'll end it there. I train arms twice a week. I train arms today, and I train arms 3 days ago. So I do a Tuesday, Friday situation. I have enough time to recover. And I have four total exercises. So I do two on first day, two on the second day, and I tend to stay within the 2 to 4 set range. Depends on the day and how I'm feeling. If my elbows, for whatever reason, are feeling creaky or just my forearms, I cap it at two. If I'm just experiencing a day where I'm like, this is just fun, I want to keep having more fun, I want to just keep the pump going, I'll do three, and sometimes even four, but usually two or three. And the way that I split it up is I split it up into really two two major types of positions. One is arms at the side, another is arms overhead. Um, and yeah, very complicated. And on my first day, I do a rope extension where I'm emphasizing the squeeze. And then on my second day, I'll do some kind of rope extension like thing where I'm emphasizing the stretch. So I will do, for example, on my first day, what failure looks like on my first day is I get to a point where I can no longer fully straighten my elbows, and then I just kind of wah, 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 wah. But over the course of the whole set, I'm still pausing at the bottom and emphasizing that. And as the set goes on, I use less range. And then on the second day when I do that, I won't even go close to the bottom. I'll just kind of grease the groove in this top half of the range and fail there until I can't squeak out of the top. So those are two of the variations that I do, a squeeze focus and a stretch focus with my arms at my sides. I will do one day I'll do like a rope overhead or a single arm overhead. Either one of those is great. And with the overhead stuff, I don't tend to lock out. It's just my personal preference. I think training the lockout position is just it's easier done. Makes a little bit more sense to me with the arms at the sides. So I kind of just do an overhead rope. Kind of chill in that range. That's exercise three, and then exercise four is typically something that is not still overhead and short focus, but it tends to be something that's more of like a pressy focus. But my arms are still kind of here, so it's like I still have my arms here for three of the four and here for one of the four. And when I do the pressy focus thing, it's kind of just like a exactly what you would visualize, cables going behind me. I'm doing some kind of press. And some of the time, I will just uh, again, situationally, this will be different, but I might also just double down on the squeezy stuff if the stretchy stuff isn't feeling super good. I might just do a second version of rope triceps where I'm pausing at the bottom. And that's mostly just because like when I do the sort of pressy type stuff, it tends to in general be heavier, in that stretch position, which if you do too much of it all the time, it tends not to feel super great on the elbows and the tendons. So yeah, I'll basically just do four variations with the squeeze and the stretch focus, and one of them being overhead, one of them being more of a pressy thing. And I do it that way mostly just because I think it just provides enough variability, but I don't really tend to get crazy with anything. I will also add the context that when I do my presses and my chest training in general, I tend not to do pressing variations where my triceps are really coming on board very much. And so for some people, maybe it seems like I'm doing a lot of triceps training because if you add up the maximum number of sets, it could be 16 totals, anywhere between 12 and 16 total sets to failure or beyond. And someone might not need, even half of that if they're doing a lot of pressing volume with a lot of triceps work. So like my chest work is mostly like flies, and if I'm doing some kind of pressing variation, it will typically be with cables or a machine that is converging, and where I'm really either using the bottom half or the chest is most involved. I tend not to sort of do variations where I'm getting a lot of tricep just because that's how I like to train. As you know, at this point, Faz, I like to take the sniper approach rather than the shotgun approach. So yeah, that's kind of everything from me. And rep ranges is kind of exactly what you would think. Can float between 6 or 7 and 15 somewhere for pretty much all of those. And yeah, everything as I mentioned is um, at that point of just not being really able to move at all at the end of all those sets. So I don't know if you want to respond to any of that first, if you have a response, but I would also just like to hear kind of how you lay things out.
I do have one thing to point out, which was it's a nice, interesting segue. This idea of fractional sets and the spillover volume that we get. I think originally, I can't remember who it was. It might have been Lyle McDonald who pointed out that the way we were counting fractional sets. So just to explain what that means for people. Let's say we're doing some kind of chest press. This idea that because the triceps are involved, we might count them as half a set, or like the front delts might be half a set. Now, whoever put forward that idea, whoever it was, I think to Ben's point, it's not necessarily going to be um, true for everyone. Like I know from my experience, I did a video on fractional sets a couple of months ago. I had a few questions about that, and my perspective is you're going to need to look at your level of your level of involvement and contribution for the way you press or the way you pull, and then base that off how much that extra set is worth for that secondary muscle. Like I know for me, if when I'm doing chest pressing, no matter what I do, I get a lot of triceps, and I can't really help it. So they're always going to come into play. So the level of tricep work that I do, as well as the modality as well. I tend to use a lot of cables. I don't tend to use a lot of bar work or dumbbells. Otherwise, my elbows get beat up pretty quickly because it's a lot of tricep for me. I think you have to just bear that in mind with your own programming. And I really like what you had to say about that because it is very individual. Whereas I'm completely the opposite with my biceps. I get zero, almost zero biceps from my back work at all. And I think that's partly because my back is very strong, it's very dominant. Biceps aren't so much, and that's just been exacerbated over the years. So I think that's a really interesting topic, one which people would just generally sort of hand wave it and say it's half a set. But I just don't think that's true practically. We're looking at very different bodies and things. Just before I go on to what I do, what's your opinion on that?
No, I mean, I just think it makes total sense. And it's difficult for people to, it's, it's tricky because let's imagine like on the receiving end of this conversation is a beginner who doesn't exactly know. When I say beginner, I mean like beginner intermediate, because I don't think any actual beginner like is probably not listening to this in the first place. So let's just say like intermediate who's kind of in that stage of like they kind of feel confident about the things that they're doing, but not completely. They have a lot of remaining questions. Sometimes they finish a set and they feel this thing. Other times they finish a set and they feel this other thing. I feel like it's probably um, what probably matters most is that you standardize, because if you standardize, even if things aren't perfectly accurate in terms of how you're tracking volume, at least you're keeping things the same. And at least then you can just adjust things from there. So if there's any sort of foolproof way to go about it, I would just say that if you keep things fixed and then you make assessments based on those fixed things, that will give you the best chance at understanding, okay, how much stimulus do I actually need to grow? Am I getting enough or am I not? And then you can adjust volume and how much attention you pay to direct work based off of that. But if you're super confident about like, a simple way to be super confident about your triceps involvement with chest work is like just do, if you have the opportunity to just do only cable motions like flies and cable presses, very, 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 very little triceps involvement in any of that stuff. And in fact, with, let's say a machine chest fly, your bicep, literally the opposite muscles are going to be the ones that are involved. So if you're worried about that, for any reason, and you really just want to be sure, like, okay, I'm really just sticking to my triceps stuff on an isolation level, then just pick chest movements that you feel only really in your chest, and then pick triceps movements that are just, always forever and always triceps movements. And so then you can be really sure. But if you're kind of like, no, I like to do these pressing things, then I would advise just stick with the standardization, do that for a while, make the changes when you observe the consequences of whatever you're doing.
No, love it. Yeah, great. So in terms of what I do for my triceps, I also train my triceps twice a week now, which has been pretty consistent for the past 10 years. Um, I will do two tricep exercises. At the moment, I'm only doing one set each. So all out set. I have done two sets, which works okay as well, but I like one set. If I'm doing two, it'll be a top set, back off set kind of deal. But at the moment, I'm doing just one. So I just repeat the exercises on both days just for simplicity, because I find I connect really well with the two that I do. So I will do a seated push down with the cable overhead and the bench at about a 45-degree angle. That's an old Charles Poliquin thing, which he was a big fan of. But I will use a straight bar for that, with the focus mostly on the squeeze at the bottom. And the stretch is okay, but it's really more about the squeeze. I find that to be just super comfortable on the elbows. I can go heavy in terms of my form, because I am handling weights which are approximating roughly an 8 to 10 rep max, there's not a lot of wiggle room for uh, sort of any momentum at all. So I'm keeping things very, very slow. You're very prototypical 3 seconds up, kind of one or two down, and then squeezing at the bottom. And as a result, the reps are generally fairly low. We're looking at about eight-ish is what I aim for. Once I'm done with that, I then pop the cable down and I'll do an overhead kind of thing. That will be with a rope, just so that I can get a better range of motion. That is when I really emphasize the stretch. I like that feeling. It feels good. I pull my shoulder as far back as I can get it, elbow as far back as I can get it, really emphasize that stretch. And I'll pause in the stretch for about a second before I drive up. In terms of lockout for that, I do try, but it's quite an awkward position to lock out. And I think if I'm forcing the lockout in that position, I'm going to really reduce the amount of weight that I can handle for the rest of the movement. So that's an area where I don't really like to force that. It's kind of like pausing a row at the chest. I think if in some exercises like a barbell bent over row, if you insist on doing that, the level of weight that you can handle on the rest of the motion is so ineffective. So same with the overhead tricep extension stuff. Heavy enough that I can get a good stretch out at the bottom and I can get it up most of the way, but we're talking to about here, and that's enough for me. So again, fairly similar to what you do. But because I connect with those two exercises so well, I tend to do those twice a week for about one set apiece. So my current tricep volume is 4 sets, which is about the same for most body parts at this point. And I will say, while I don't think I'm bigger than I was 2018 when I was mid 30s, I think I've made some improvements to my physique. So my arms are definitely better. I put up a picture recently on my Instagram, and while I'm overall smaller, I think there's more balance to my physique. My upper back is better. My arms are definitely better. My biceps are definitely better. So the overall package probably translates better to stage if I ever decide to hop back on stage. But that's what I've been doing. Now, in terms of general sort of pressing movements, for shoulders and triceps, I do all isolations. I don't really find any value in overhead pressing at all. I've caught a lot of flack for that on my channel before. A lot of controversy. People take that really personally. I don't find any value for the overhead press in terms of like the medial delt at all. And I find front delts get work plenty with chest pressing. So I tend to opt for incline pressing as incline pressing as part of my chest work, as well as some fly work which I normally do on cables. Kind of like I do a combination of some flies on cables, seated cables, so I'm nice and stable, as well as a sort of fly press, which works really nice. I like that. It just takes the stress off the shoulder and puts it instead on the elbow, which is a bit more manageable for me. So same kind of movement. And I'll do one heavy press per day. But yeah, all my shoulder work is all medial delt isolation. I like cables. Line cable cuff lateral is great. Single cable laterals is great, but I've consistently just found pretty much zero shoulder benefit from overhead press. It's and only recovery issues. If I'm trying to make it work, all it's going to do is just put a lot more stress on my elbows and shoulders. So that's kind of my stance. Well, my audience knows that, but that's my stance on that. How do you feel about that kind of thing?
Well, unfortunately, Faz, I'm very aligned with that.
Okay.
So we can't have a quabble or a quibble here, whatever it's called, about that. Um, yeah, I just think that like with if you ask someone like what is their goal in doing an overhead press, and they say middle delts, then the discussion we just need to have a different discussion about like what's actually going on there,
Yeah.
which maybe we save that for another time.
Yeah.
Um, if their answer is front delts, then I'm confused because I'm like,
Right.
well, it's like, how much front delt work do you possibly need if you're doing sufficient chest training? I don't, seems like very little, if any. I've never met a person with like really weak front delts who's doing a ton of chest pressing. Um, and then if they say triceps, then I have questions because I'm like, why would you do that over a triceps extension? And then if they say traps, and then I have a similar response, which would be, why wouldn't you do something that's much more trap specific? So it's kind of exists to me in this weird like no specific target zone, but many specific targets zone, where on some level it's like, okay, if you're at a point where you can make significant progress in all of those muscle groups with an overhead press, fine. But it's just we're having a very different conversation at that point, and we're talking to someone very different. So I think if people enjoy it, and I'm sure you would say this, if people love overhead press, sure, go, do it. Um, a lot of times, just to add this, what I find is that with overhead press, a lot of times what people really mean is like upper chest press that is disguised as overhead press. Because overhead press to me is like you're doing this very vertical thing. But a lot of people, they will get set up on like an overhead press machine, and
Yeah.
they will just everything will just they'll just tip themselves back and end up doing something that's like pressing there. So if you want to call that overhead, sure, go, well, we can make that case. But no, I'm very aligned, and that's kind of how I treat my shoulder training as well. Uh,
People will say the most insane reasons to carry on doing the overhead press. They get very emotional about it. The one that I heard was if you don't overhead press, you will lose the ability to raise your arms in that position. So I just thought to myself, so my mother, who doesn't train with weights at all, so she just can't lift her arms overhead. She just doesn't have that function. It's honestly the most baffling thing. The amount of like emotional outpouring there was about that video was just insane. So yeah, people have a strange affinity towards it. I will say I have one client. This is for perspective. I have one client who does do the overhead press twice a week. However, with his routine, it's kind of the opposite. We'll prioritize overhead pressing, where we'll do variations of the standing press as well as the seated press, and his chest work will be purely isolation. And I think that's one instance where it can work, because then you kind of have the opposite situation, because you're not getting that excessive elbow, shoulder, and front delt loading you are from lots and lots of bench pressing. Generally speaking, though, most people want to have to prioritize incline pressing or flat pressing, and that's why they end up doing a lot of medial delt isolation work. But that's one instance. But even then, I'm not particularly happy with it. I do it for him because he likes to overhead press. I still don't think it's great for the side delt. So yeah, it's just not something which I like to program. And I program it specifically for him because he has those goals. But yeah, generally, I just don't think it's great. I think I said a few years ago that I'm going to call for the elimination of the overhead pressing bodybuilding routines, and then in about 5 years, everyone will cotton on, and they'll obviously they won't credit me because that's how the industry is. That was my house, but clearly there are other people saying the same thing, so that's good. Yeah.
Yeah, and also like to the point of the overhead thing, it also assumes that you wouldn't ever be doing anything that requires your arm to go overhead that isn't overhead press. Like people imagine it's the only thing you could do, but this is an exercise like the Y raise exercise with the cable.
Mm.
That is an exercise that um if I had to give any kind of like credence to the idea of a shoulder health exercise, which is like it's kind of like a non-term to me. It's like, what does that mean? Shoulder health exercise, always context dependent. But um, a lot of people who have had shoulder issues from here up respond very well to a load that is pulling them anteriorly in front of them, against which they have to move backward, as compared to a variation where they're trying to maintain this sort of cranked external rotation position as they then move through that sort of flexion. It just tends to be not super comfortable. Like there's a reason that people tend to want to kind of put their arms in front of their body when they come overhead, and that's mostly like just a how much rotation do they have access to thing. The wider you move this way, the more you're going to have to kind of allow your arms to come this way. And one final point on that, I think it's a funny story. Tom Purvis, who is kind of he's one of the first people to ever really talk a lot about like the exercise physics stuff. I was at his gym in Oklahoma a couple years back, and when we walked in there, he has like, all the pieces that he has are basically custom made, where he's one of those guys who, he can weld, he understands like equipment mechanics better than anyone I've met. And I noticed when I walked into the gym, it was like there was no like vertical pressing machine. And I was like, what's the rationale? Why do you not have any? He's like, why would you need one then? Which I just thought was, is just kind of a funny anecdote. But yeah, the gist of that is, yeah, I don't think any of those claims surrounding like, it's kind of like when people say, if you don't deadlift, for example, how are you going to be able to pick
Exactly.
something up off the floor? I'm like, well, I can just show you, I can just show you how to do that. Um, so yeah, Faz, this was fantastic. Did you have anything else, final thoughts you wanted to finish up with?
No, no, just thank you so much for having me back on again. Yeah, I'm more than happy to come on again. It's always enjoyable chat, and also the first half really very interesting for me to learn all that kind of stuff, and hopefully the audience followed along because yeah, I followed along really well. So enjoyed it very much. So
All
thank you.
right, awesome, man. And pleasure. Anyone who's still listening, thanks for listening. Drop a comment if you want me and Faz to do more of these, and if so, what you would like us to talk about next. All right,
We're, we're
everyone.
still we're still going on with that PvP channel. We've been
Yeah, 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 yeah.
streaming 12 hours a day.
We're keeping it secret. Any WoW players in the audience, please comment, please, please, please. We only had a couple comments last time, but we're trying to get this going. All right, brother.
Right. Thank you.